Welcome back to Untaught Essentials. This is part two of my conversation with Dr. Parneet Pal, the Chief Science Officer of Wisdom Labs. In this episode, we're going to take our conversation about well-being and extend it from the person to the planet. And I quite frankly think you will absolutely find this conversation utterly fascinating. I know that it changed my perspective of how not only I see myself, but what's a healthy body and how is this body in relationship to the environment around us. So we're going to dive right back in, and I hope you enjoy it.
Talk of that, but then start to think about, where did this food come from? Where was it grown? Like, under what conditions? And what impact did it leave on wherever the food came from? And so, for me, when I was trying to sort of figure out, okay, what is my part that I can play sort of in the climate conversation, and how can I sort of contribute to planetary health? Because yes, of course, reduce fossil fuel consumption and try to recycle and reuse, all of that is good. But then I came across some of these statistics around our food production and consumption systems that really were unexpected. So the way that we produce and consume and distribute food globally accounts for 25% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll just repeat that. It accounts for 25% of our greenhouse gas emissions. I think we don't intuitively think of food as being such a huge contributor to climate change. But then it also accounts for 80% of the deforestation that has taken place.
Wow.
And it accounts for 70% of biodiversity loss on land and 50% of the biodiversity loss in oceans. And I know I've rattled off a bunch of statistics there, but it is just absolutely stunning when you take a look at, wow, my choices on food are having this incredible deleterious impact on not just climate, but biodiversity loss and the rest of our planetary system. So that's sort of one point to consider. And then when you take a look at, even if, keeping all that aside, how was this, even if I'm eating the healthiest of foods, what's the quality of the soil that it was grown in? And what we're finding is that because of, again, sort of big farming and big agriculture practices and the use of pesticides and herbicides, like Roundup, which is sort of a weed killer that's used ubiquitous, like it's used everywhere. I heard one statistic that 75% of the rain and air that we breathe in the US contains Roundup. So it's literally everywhere around us. But these pesticides, again, are hugely inflammatory to our cells and hugely inflammatory. They produce, again, that they disrupt that microbiome balance in our guts. But they're also causing sort of this, this dysbiosis that's happening in our guts, you can think of the same thing as happening with the soils. So normally the soils is, when there's a lot of biodiversity, you have lots of plant species and their roots, again, it's a system. It's not like one plant by itself. There's this network of millions of hundreds of thousands of bacteria and fungi in the root system. Again, the symbiotic relationship that is increasing the quality of the soil, making it rich, nutrient rich, which means that will have impact on the food that we eat. But also it's helping to keep the soil in place, so preventing soil erosion and water runoff. And so farming practices that are sort of monoculture based, that are laden with pesticides, are destroying that ecosystem. And so, which is impacting sort of the climate and, the land, the deforestation and, the water runoff and all of that. But then at a very selfish level, even if you don't want to think about the planet, think about the impact that that's having on your health, because you're eating that food that was grown in this nutrient deficient soil. And in fact, now we know that even if you're eating sort of a healthy green vegetable, that itself can be inflammatory if it's been grown under these kinds of conditions, which again is mind-blowing, you know. So I think for me, I find it very depressing, but at the same time, I find it very empowering. Wow, each one of us has the choice, has 2 to 3, you know, during our day. Hopefully we're not eating 5 meals now after this conversation and snacking for lots afterwards. You know, the 2 to 3 meals that we have, you know, that can be the action step that I take towards protecting not just my health, but the health of the planet. To just give a little more thought and consideration into where the food has come from and how I can make sure that I vote through my dollars for the, you know, for the production of foods that have been grown sustainably, that are whole foods based.
A couple of things that I was at a certain grocery store the other day and noticing in January they're selling blueberries, and the blueberries come from South America. And then I thought, and they're only like $4.99 a pint or something like that. But that $4.99 a pint actually also includes all the fuel charges and moving the thing from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. And you know, what is this really healthy was the question I had for myself. But one thing I wanted to go back to earlier was that, you know, you talked about that the biological system has a rest system and a growth system, right? And that we've really prioritized or overemphasized the growth system as opposed to the rest system. And because of that, it creates all of these imbalances and sets the stage for a kind of disease scenario to play out. And it occurred to me like, wow, that's also similar to how the economy works, right? That the economy is based on kind of continual growth.
Right.
And, you know, and when I work with executives, you know, a lot of when we talk about stress response, right, which I don't really talk about in that way anymore, what we're really talking about is an overexcited nervous system response, and that people are oftentimes living in organizations that prioritize that overexcited nervous system response.
Mm-hmm.
That's embedded in economy that itself is prioritizing a constant growth orientation, right? And it struck me one day that kind of fractal of what I experience personally, right, in terms of, okay, how do I manage a nervous system, is also being experienced organizationally, which is also being experienced in our communities on a, you know, in an economy that is all oriented around one kind of direction. And it's creating these kind of fundamental imbalances that that don't allow for a proper restoration, rebalancing of the whole organism, right? And it's kind of fascinating, right, when you think about it from that way, right? I mean, right down to our molecules, this system is functioning to the planetary sphere, right?
It is. It's really humbling when you sort of step back and appreciate the complexity and just the artistry of these interconnected systems and the millions of years of evolutionary intelligence that's embedded in these systems, and how humans have literally the power to disrupt them so quickly with this kind of, you know, growth at all costs kind of mentality. And this is some of the work that maybe you're familiar with, the economist Kate Raworth has done when she talks about the donut economy, and which is this idea of how can we put checks and balances so that we can bring everyone into sort of, you know, if you think of a donut, that fleshy part of the donut being sort of the safe and just zone for humanity, where we can provide for the basic needs of nutrition and, you know, education and housing and work for everyone on the planet, but without exceeding that outer planetary boundaries, which is these boundaries around climate change and our air pollution and our land use and biodiversity loss. And she points to this idea where the focus has to shift from this desire for unrestricted growth and just sort of reset and realize that this redistribution will require some parts of the globe to, yes, to continue on that growth trajectory because they need it, whereas other parts, usually our westernized nations, will sort of have to take a break and just sort of rest and restore. And I think, you know, it's kind of poetic when you think about just like the mind states and, you know, sort of this cognitive state that we're all in, a lot of us. I mean, unfortunately, more and more globally, but especially in industrialized Western cultures, is because of that lack of that rest and restoration phase, it's really affecting our cognition. So we have, you know, Adam Ghazali is a neuroscientist at UCSF, and he coined this term. He calls it the cognition crisis. And he talks about the fact that we have access to more information and data than ever before and the best technology possible. And yet our attention systems, our perception systems, our ability to metabolize that information, to convert that into wisdom, to regulate our emotions, to engage our empathy and compassion, all of those have been decreasing. And a lot of it has to do with the design of our technology. You know, I mean, we're all familiar with how social media and just access to the internet sort of disrupts our attention and distracts us, but also sort of makes us more prone to sort of this addiction, you know, getting that dopamine hit of a notification. But as you, I know, are so familiar with this, is that this lack of rest and restoration, this being constantly on and being constantly sort of in that awake mode, is disrupting our ability to make good decisions. I think at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to, is that we are making really lousy decisions. We've created this environment around us and a lifestyle where we're making really lousy decisions about our personal health and really lousy decisions in our business and for the planet.
Because we're constantly in this, you know, what I call the red zone of hyperactivity, you know, of a defensive hyperactivity of just running around and thinking about, you know, when you thinking about how, you know, that there's I think an emerging realization that there's certain kinds of skills that we need. You know, we're all using our minds to make a living now, and yet we're never given any tools to manage those minds. And the fundamental aspect of that is, you know, how do you manage your nervous system? But that, and so we're, I think, as a culture, kind of mismanaging our nervous system in this orientation towards constant activity. And it seems to me that one of the eye-opening, maybe silver linings of this pandemic is the realization that, wow, if I don't get rest, I really am going to lose it. You know, I've heard that from so many people that it's, you know, that they can't escape that reality anymore because they're being put face to face with it. You know, that you can't run 24/7, you know, that the boundary between work and home is now absolutely non-existent. And that if you have children, you know, that they need attention too. And like, how do you manage all of that? You can't manage it by just running faster, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I'd kind of be curious to know what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, so again, I think for me, there are two things to keep in mind with that. One is, as you mentioned before, you know, I always like to see this as a frame for increasing a sense of agency. So we have no control or very little control about the things that happen around us or to us, but we have 100% control on how we choose to respond to it. And this is how we build our resilience, right? So we were talking about these adaptive stress systems. So I think that's one piece there, is how can we use this opportunity now that we've come to this realization, we're sort of have had this time to re-examine our lifestyles and our daily routines and sort of re-engaging with the relationships that we may have ignored or neglected, or even taking a look at the way that we work and our routines there and what needs to change. So, and again, through that frame of resilience, yes, these things have that homeostasis is off, and I have the power to change that through the choices that I make. But then to get to that space, because if you're already in a very highly stressed state, I think the first step, as we know, often starts with managing our mind and managing our levels of stress. And this is where mindfulness practices are really useful, meditation practices, but certainly you can start to move yourself and your moods into that zone. Maybe it's mindfulness for one person, maybe for another person it's just increasing an hour of sleep. Because when we know that even just one night of sleep deprivation makes our amygdala 60% more reactive the next day. We know that sleep deprivation increases our propensity for feeling lonely and not wanting to engage socially with others. So it increases sort of our inclination towards being more anxious, more depressed, more lonely. And so maybe for somebody who may not be inspired or may not be interested in meditation or mindfulness, maybe they can start to take a look at their sleep patterns and start there. For somebody else, it might be, wow, I think I need to cut out, this XYZ junk food that I've been eating and see what that happens. I think, it's really important for everyone to know that we have so much choice. And we have so many points of entry. And this is the beauty of being part of an ecosystem, is that there's not a one size fits all. There are some basic principles, but you can really customize it to your own life, to wherever you might be on the planet, and take a look, just take some time to examine this and see, okay, what am I motivated to change in this moment? And taking that first step can often then sort of have this domino effect, and then you start to see changes in one aspect of your life, and then that makes you feel better, and then you choose another aspect of your life.
It's like intervene somewhere in the system,
exactly,
right? Ideally,
exactly.
get more sleep, and then from there you can kind of spin out, right? Right. I want to go back to the planetary part, because I think that's something that we need to really understand more about, and it's obvious, right, that how things are right now are not only are not working, but are like actively destructive, right, to not just human well-being but planetary well-being. And what do you see as, and you touched upon this in terms of Kate Raworth's donut economics, which is I'm guessing a high fiber vegan donut, right? But say more about that. Like what's the model in your head for how different alternatives could be brought to bear on this?
So I think from we're talking about just planetary health in general, right, or the climate crisis.
And then tie that to what I hear is that the fractal is that we are overbalanced towards activity in some way, right? Mm-hmm. And that there is an underbalance of resting and repairing, mm-hmm. not just at a personal level, but at an economic and planetary level, right? We mm-hmm. use more resources before they can replenish themselves, for example. Yeah. Yeah. And so so you could start with, and we've kind of talked about what a person can do, right, to rebalance their lives, but then go big picture, right? Like dream together. Like what does that look like?
That requires the most that requires wise leadership. So when you look at the solutions to all these issues, right? And there's so many people, so many entrepreneurs and organizations who are working on climate solutions. So whether it's in the fossil fuel industry, alternative sources of energy, or whether it's regenerative agriculture and replenishing the soils, producing, redistribute, food systems that need to change. For folks who are interested, they might want to take a look at Drawdown, which is the project Drawdown, which is basically a research compilation of the top 100 solutions to climate, evidence-based solutions to climate change in all of these sectors. And so for me, the takeaway is that we have the solutions. Yes, we'll come up with like an even better technology. And yes, we can make the existing solutions even more efficient in the next few years. But at this moment, we have all the knowledge that we need. For example, we have enough resources and to produce enough food to feed the 10 billion people that we expect to be on the planet by 2050. So it's not a lack of those resources, it's a lack of political will. And political will and a lack of sort of leadership in businesses. So I think for me, that is the key. I mean, there are so many, Kate Raworth says one economic model, but there are so many, just the general tenet of the circular economy, for example, which is about reusing, making sure there's no waste in the system. There's no waste in the biological system. So you're not wasting, a third of the food that we produce is wasted, by the way. So making sure that, that doesn't happen. But then even on the sort of material technological side is that putting things back into the system so that there's no waste. So all of that is happening. And yet, when you actually examine, has anything really changed in, when you step outside your house and if you see, we are having this conversation about examining the food on our plate, but there are billions of people on the planet who don't have that choice and that freedom and that access. So I think there's a bigger conversation around equity and access to resources, to the basic minimum that's needed for health. We have, I think it's something like 1 in 3 people in the world are overweight or obese, but we still have 1 in 12 or 10 people that are suffering from malnutrition and that don't have enough food on their plates.
So again, another kind of example of gross imbalance, in some way.
Exactly. Right? And so it's, but then when you go into your grocery stores, yes, we've seen some shifts in your choices that are available, but for the most part, it's the same. How many of us are engaged with sort of our local political leaders and having this conversation around the changes that we want to see in our systems? So I think that, I think we're beginning to have that conversation. I think people are beginning to understand the importance. And I think the biggest irony of all of this is that, we've entered the 6th mass extinction. We will die, but the planet will live on. So, these bacteria, the microbiome, they've been around for billions of years and they have the ability to thrive in the most severe environments. So they're going to make it. And the question is, will we be wise enough to make the decisions today to ensure that the rest of humanity survives?
It's not whether life survives, it's about whether human life survives.
Exactly.
and then civilized human life, right, in that way, because that is its own set of delicate circumstances that keep that in place, right?
And there are many good conversations like the UN, the COP26 summit that's happening later this year, the UN Food Summit that's happening. So I think, these there are lots of really engaged, active people as part of this conversation, but I think we still haven't sort of reached that tipping point when it comes to business leaders and political leaders who can kind of see beyond that short-term gain and kind of take that big picture approach to changing the systems, because, and I think what gives me inspiration, though, is just, the way that we've responded with the COVID vaccine, for example. We just and the changes, the lockdowns that took place, when we put our minds to it, we can create massive change on a global scale, no problem. And so I think that's the kind of base that we need to think about now for our health and for our climate as well.
What has the pandemic experience either taught you or reconfirmed for you or shown you that that wasn't as conscious or present before? I'm just curious to know.
Well, on a personal level, I think it reiterated the importance of connection for me. Mm-hmm. So, the whole epidemic of loneliness is sort of very near and dear to my heart. So, I've experienced many moments of loneliness, and we know that those rates are rising globally. And I think the pandemic sort of put a neat little bow on it, and the effects that it has on our immune system and just the way that we show up in the world. So for me, that was, it kind of motivated me to continue focusing on that aspect, both in my personal life, to deepen my connections, to invest the time needed. I think for me globally, the pandemic, I think, the obvious thing is it showed that this imbalance, I mean, it was a zoonosis created because of this disconnection, sort of our lack of respect for these boundaries or nurturing of the ecosystem. I think it left me with hope in the end. I think I haven't ever witnessed so many people having a conversation about their health, especially their mental health. I think I haven't, I think it sort of accelerated the conversations people were having around even climate now. I think, these conversations at the political and business levels, I think will have a very different flavor post-COVID than they would have had COVID not happened. So I think on balance, if we live up to our name of Homo sapiens, if we are wise enough and present enough, I think the pandemic has been a huge opportunity for us to make those changes that have been, that we have neglected for a very long time.
I think that's beautiful. What I come away with from this conversation is a view that, starting with what is a human being, as a collection of interrelated organisms, that not just within the body, but that it's also extending into the environment, right? And that you're being co-created by not just you, right, but all these living creatures that are inside your body and on your body and around your body. Yeah. And that extends out to the whole planet. And that it really made me think about, what are we as living creatures, and where is the boundary of self start and end, and then what's your relationship to that, and that you just can't keep running forever, right? And that at some point, right, that system needs to rest. And in a lot of nuanced meanings of what rest means, right? Not just sleeping and taking a nap, but how do you take time to heal and repair and restore, not just your own personal self, but all the little creatures that are supporting you internally and externally, but then also at a macro cosmic scale of the planet, right? And yeah. It's a really beautiful picture you paint. Right?
Thank you.
And it's all rooted in this kind of fundamental biology. There's nothing woo-woo about it, right? It's just, this is the way these systems operate. And because we're so illiterate about these systems, we can think that you know, kind of makes the idea of, hey, forget the planet, let's go colonize Mars, seems so absolutely absurd, right? Because how are you going to recreate a functioning planetary ecosystem on a planet that doesn't have one?
And even if we did, I think for me, one of the biggest sort of realizations through this process is just realizing, this whole notion of independence, that we are sort of, or individualism, we are interdependent. I mean, there's no way around that. We are interdependent on others, other human beings. We're interdependent on other species. We're interdependent on the resources on our planet for our health and well-being. And the sooner that we realize that, I think the better it will be. Otherwise, even if, I have nothing against people going to Mars and exploring other planets, more power to them. But I think the tragedy would be, after investing all those resources, if we went in there with the same mindset, we would just replicate the same issues that we have here on planet Earth.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, there's obviously so much more to talk about, but let's put a bookmark here. And thank you, Parneet. It was truly stimulating conversation. So thank you. And let's do it again.
Yes, thank you so much, Jeremy. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast. Give us a review and tell us your thoughts. The best thing you can do is share this with someone who would find it interesting and helpful. If you have an idea for other topics you'd like to explore, please let us know. Contact me at info@jeremyhunter.net. Thank you to the multi-talented Mr. Jason Beck for making the magic happen behind the scenes. And our music is the creation of Jeffrey with a G Munger. You can learn more about his work at kettleblackmusic.com.